Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. When I was a little girl, I remember begging and pleading with my parents to let my dear cousin Susan come to spend the night. Almost always my parents were happy to let her stay, and we would stay up late and tell stories and talk about how we hoped our lives would go. Something similar happens to Heidi when Clara and Grandmama finally come to the mountain meadow to visit. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi, Chapter 20. News from Distant Friends. The month of May had come. From the highlands, the waters of the brooks, swollen by the spring thawing, rushed down into the valley. The mountain was bathed in warm, bright sunshine. The last snow had melted away, and awakened by the soft charm of the sunlight, the whole earth had grown green again. The bright eyes of the first flowers were peering forth from the new grass. The merry breezes of spring were blowing through the fir trees and shaking off their withered dark needles, so that the bright green new needles might come out and give the trees a dress of fresh splendor. The old bird of prey flapped his wings in the blue air high above the world, and all around the hut on the mountain meadow the golden sunshine lay warm upon the ground and dried up the last wet places, so that one could stretch himself at ease wherever he wished to be. Heidi was back on the mountain again. She ran here and there and did not know which spot she found the loveliest. At one time, the wind tempted her to listen to its deep and mysterious notes as it roared down from the cliffs above. It would come nearer and grow in power. It would dart to the trees, shake them and toss them, and then the wind would seem to howl in loud delight. And Heidi, too, would cry out in her joy while she was being blown to and fro like a tender leaf. At another time she would run back to the sunny spot in front of the hut, sit down on the ground, and hunt about in the short grass to find out how many flower cups were open, or nearly so. Such swarms of gnats and young beetles were hopping and crawling and dancing madly about in the sun that Heidi must be happy too. She breathed in the sweet air of spring that seemed to rise from the freshly opened earth, and she felt that surely the mountain had never before been so beautiful. And the 1,000 little creatures liked it as well as she, for they were all humming and singing into Heidi's ears the chorus, "On the mountain, ah! On the mountain, ah!" From the shop behind the cottage came the frequent sounds of hammering and sawing. Heidi paused to listen to these familiar noises that she knew so well, for they had greeted her ears ever since she first came to live on the mountain meadow. Every now and then she just had to jump up and run to the shop to discover what Grandfather was doing. Before the door of the shop a fine new chair was standing, all ready for use, and the old gentleman was skillfully at work on a second one. "Oh, I know what that's for!" Heidi cried gaily.
"Do you really?"
Grandfather asked. "We'll need that when they come from Frankfurt. This one's for Grandmama, and the one you're making is for Clara, and besides, I suppose we'll have to make one more," Heidi went on to say more slowly. "Or do you think, Grandfather, that perhaps Miss Rottenmeier won't come after all?"
"I can't say, of course, but the safest thing is to have one ready, so we can ask her to sit down if she does come."
Heidi looked doubtfully at the small wooden chairs, which were without arms and backs, wondering quietly how they would suit Miss Rottenmeier. After a while, shaking her head doubtfully, she said, "Grandfather, I don't believe she'd sit on them."
Then we'll ask her to sit on the sofa that has the beautiful green sod for a covering,"
the old gentleman answered calmly. While Heidi was wondering where the beautiful sod covering might be, there suddenly came from above them the sound of whistling and calling. A rod swished through the air. Heidi knew at once what that meant. She darted away and was quickly surrounded by the goats that ran down to meet her. They must have felt as good as Heidi did to be up on the mountain again, for they jumped higher and bleated more fiercely than ever before, and they crowded Heidi one way and another in their eagerness to get close to her and tell them how glad they were. But Peter shoved them aside right and left, for he himself had a message to deliver to Heidi. When he had got close enough, he handed her a letter. "There you are," he said, leaving Heidi to find out the rest for herself. She was very much surprised. "Why, did you find a letter for me in the pasture?" she asked in her amazement. "No," was Peter's only answer. "Well, where did you find it then?"
"In my dinner bag."
And he told the truth, but not all of it. The evening before, the postmaster in the hamlet had given Peter the letter for Heidi. He had thrust it into his empty bag. That morning, when he was starting from home, he had put his cheese and bread in on top of it. To be sure, he had seen both Nuncle and Heidi when he had come for the goats, but not until he had finished eating his bread and cheese that noon, and was hunting around for the last crumbs in the bag, had he again come upon the forgotten letter. Heidi read the address on the envelope carefully. Then she ran back to the shop, and, wild with joy, held the letter out to Grandfather. "It's from Frankfurt," she cried happily, "from Clara. Shall I read it to you right off, Grandfather?" The old gentleman said he wanted to hear it, and so it seemed did Peter, for he had followed Heidi and settled himself to listen. He leaned back against the doorpost so he could have a firm support for his body and devote all his attention to following the reading of the letter. It was a long letter, and here it is. "Dear Heidi, we have everything packed up, and we are going to start in 2 or 3 days, as soon as Papa leaves. But he is not coming with us. He has to go first to Paris. The doctor comes every day, and the second he's in the house he calls, 'All aboard for the mountains!' He just can't wait until we get off. You can't imagine what a nice time he had in your Alps. The whole winter he's been coming to see us almost every day. He says he has to keep coming to my house so that he can talk it all over again. Then he sits down in my room and tells me of each day that he spent with you and Grandfather on the mountain, and he talks of the cliffs and the flowers, and of the peaceful quiet up there above all the villages and streets, and of how fresh the pure air is. He often says, 'Everybody must get well up there.' He himself is very much changed from what he used to be, and now he seems quite young and happy again. Oh, how glad I shall be to see it all myself, to be with you on the mountain, and to be friends with Peter and the goats. First, I have to go to Ragaz for a 6-week stay. That is what the doctor orders. Then we are to live in Dörfli, and when the weather is nice, I shall be carried up the mountain in my chair to spend the day with you. Grandmama's coming along to stay with me. She is looking forward to seeing you again. But what do you think? Miss Rottenmeier does not want to come. Almost every day, Grandmama asks her, 'How about a journey to Switzerland, my worthy Rottenmeier? If you want to go along, don't be backward in saying so.' But she always thanks her politely and says that she would only be in the way. But I know what the housekeeper is thinking about. Sebastian told her such a terrible yarn about the mountain when he came back from his trip. He said frightful cliffs frowned down on you, and there was always danger of falling into ravines and pits, and the way up was so steep that you might fall off backward at any minute. He said he believed goats might climb up the trail, but no human being could do it without constant danger of his life. Miss Rottenmeier shuddered at what Sebastian said and hasn't been so fond of Swiss journeys since. Tinette too got scared, and she isn't coming. So we are coming by ourselves, just Grandmama and I. Sebastian travels as far as Ragaz with us, and then turns back again. Goodbye, Heidi dear. Oh, I just can't wait until I get to you. Grandmama sends you 1,000 good wishes. Your true friend, Clara. When Peter had heard what the letter said, he sprang away from the doorpost and swung his rod right and left so crazily and angrily that fear seized all the goats, and they fairly flew down the mountain. In fact, they took such enormous jumps as they had rarely taken before. Peter tore after them, waving his rod in the air as if he was trying to work off his evil rage on some enemy that could not be seen. This enemy of Peter's was his thought about the guests who were coming from Frankfurt. Heidi, on the other hand, was so full of joy and happiness the next day, she just had to go down and pay Grandmother a visit. She was longing to tell her everything, who was coming from Frankfurt, and especially who was not coming. Grandmother, Heidi felt sure, would find her news of the greatest importance, for she knew all the people so well, and always showed deep interest in anything that had to do with Heidi. So early the next afternoon, Heidi set out, for now she could go alone to make her visits. At this season of the year, the sun shone brightly again, and remained a long time in the sky, and it was fun running down the mountain over the dry ground. Besides, the merry May wind roared along behind her and pushed her on at a great rate. Grandmother no longer lay abed. She was back again in her corner at the spinning wheel, and yet there was a look on her face as if her thoughts were not entirely happy ones. That look had been there since the evening before, and all through the night her bad thoughts had pursued her and kept her awake, for Peter had come home white with rage, and so far as Grandmother could make out from his confused statements, a big crowd of people seemed to be coming from Frankfurt to stay in the hut on the mountain meadow. Just what the meaning of this was he did not know, but Grandmother could not stop thinking about it, and that is the reason her mind got so troubled that she could not sleep. Then Heidi ran in and went right over to the old lady. She sat down on the little footstool that was always there, and began to pour forth her story with such eagerness that she got more and more excited by it. But then, all at once, she broke off in the middle of a sentence, and asked anxiously, "Why, Grandmother dear, whatever is the matter? Don't you like to hear this even a little bit?"
Of course I do, Heidi. I'm glad because you are going to enjoy it so," she answered, and tried to seem somewhat happier.
"Then, Grandmother, why can I see that you are worried about it? Are you afraid, perhaps, that Miss Rottenmeier will change her mind and come?" To tell the truth, Heidi herself was slightly worried on this account.
"Oh, no, it's nothing, I tell you," Grandmother said to comfort her. "Let me hold your hand a little while, dear, so that I can know you are by me still. This visit will be a good thing for you, even if I don't live to see the end of it."
"I don't want any good thing that you won't live through, dear Grandmother," Heidi said very decidedly. In fact, she spoke so firmly, as if everything was settled, that a new fear came to rest in the old lady's mind. She began to think that the people were coming from Frankfurt to take Heidi away again. For now that the child was well once more, surely they would want her back with them. This was what Grandmother feared the most, and yet she did not feel that she ought to mention the matter before Heidi. The child might be so sorry for her that she would refuse to go, and that must not be. She sought to find a way out of her difficulty, and she did not have to hunt long, for there was one thing that she always wanted.
"Heidi, I tell you," she said after a short pause, "what will make me feel better and bring back my happy thoughts? Read me the hymn that begins, 'God is warder.'"
Heidi had come to know the old hymn book so well that she found at once the place that Grandmother wanted and read it in a clear voice. God is warder. He will order thy life as is best for thee. Billows foaming in the gloaming, daunt not thy security. When she had finished, the old lady said, "Yes, that is just what I wanted to hear." And it did seem as if her heart was lighter, for the look of sorrow had now disappeared from her face. Heidi glanced at her thoughtfully a moment before she asked, "Grandmother, the word best in the hymn means that everything is healed and made whole again, doesn't it?"
"Yes, that's just what it means," the old lady said, nodding her head. "And because it's the dear God who promises to make things whole, you can count on its turning out all right, no matter how dark the future looks. Read it once more to me, Heidi, so we can learn the words by heart and never forget them."
Heidi read the closing lines of the hymn once, twice, 3 times, for God's promise of safety pleased her very much. When it grew dark, and Heidi again was strolling up the mountainside, one star after another appeared in the sky. They gleamed and sparkled down at her, exactly as if each one of them wished to send a ray of happiness to her heart. And almost every instant Heidi had to stop and look up at them, for they seemed to be twinkling at her more brightly from every part of the sky. So she called up to them, "I know what you want to tell me, you dear stars. It is because God knows so well what is wholesome and best for us that we can be so happy and walk so safely." Then the eyes of every star blinked and twinkled and winked at Heidi all the way up to the hut. And there she found Grandfather, standing and looking up at the sky, for he said the stars had not shone so brightly since he could remember. And in this month of May, not only the nights were brighter and clearer than they had been for many years, but the days were too. Grandfather would often look out of the door mornings and be surprised to notice how the sun rose in a cloudless sky, as gloriously as it had set on the previous evening. And he would say repeatedly,
"It's an uncommonly sunny year. It will give sap to the grass and herbs. Look out, General Peter, or your springers will have such good fodder that they'll get the best of you."
When Peter heard that, he swung his rod, swishing through the air, and the look on his face said plainly enough,
"Ha! I'd just like to see him try it."
So May spread by with its budding and greening, and June came with its warmer sun, and with the long light days that tempted every flower on the mountainside to put forth blossoms. They shone and glowed round about on all sides, and the air was filled with their sweet odors. And this month of June was drawing to its close when one morning Heidi, who had already finished her work about the house, came running out of the hut. She was intending to go quickly over to the fir trees, and then to climb a little higher up to see if the great bush of centauries was yet in bloom, for these flowers were the prettiest sight in the world when the sun shone through them. But just as soon as Heidi started to run around the hut, she suddenly screamed at the top of her lungs. Nuncle stepped out of his shop, for he knew something unusual had happened. Oh, Grandfather!" the child cried, beside herself with joy. "Come here and look!" The old gentleman came at her call, and his eyes followed the outstretched arm of the excited child. A strange procession, such as the mountain meadow had never seen before, was winding up the trail. First came 2 men, carrying an open basket chair, in which a young girl was sitting, wrapped up in many shawls. Then came a horse, on which a stately lady was sitting, looking about her interestedly, and having a lively chat with the young guide who walked at her side. A little way behind, there followed a wheelchair, pushed along by still another young man. The chair was empty, because the sick girl who really belonged in it could be carried up the mountain trail more safely in a basket seat. Last of all came a porter, who had the hamper on his back, piled so high with rugs and shawls and furs that they reached high above his head. "There they are!" called Heidi, jumping up and down with happiness. And there was no longer any doubt who it was that Heidi stood and watched. Nearer and nearer they came, and finally, after what seemed years of waiting, they were there. The porters set the basket chair on the ground. Heidi ran to it, and the two children hugged one another joyfully. Then Grandmama came up on her horse and dismounted. Heidi ran to her in turn and was greeted with a tender kiss. And then the old lady saw Meadow Nuncle, who had stepped forward to bid her welcome. There was no stiffness in the way they spoke to each other, for because of Heidi, they felt as if they had been friends for years. Hardly had the words of welcome been spoken, however, when Grandmama said with much enthusiasm, "My dear Nuncle, what a beautiful estate you have up here! Who in the world would have imagined it? Many a king would envy you the possession of such a place. And see how my Heidi is blooming, like a June rosebud." The old lady drew the child to her and stroked the red cheeks, and then she turned to her own little granddaughter. "What a glory there is all about us! What do you say, Clara?" The sick child was looking around her as if enchanted. She had never dreamed of anything like this in all her life. How beautiful it is here!" she cried again and again. "I never imagined it. Oh, Grandmama, I'd like to stay here always." In the meantime, Nuncle had pushed up the wheelchair, had taken some shawls out of the hamper, and made a soft seat with them. Then he went up to the basket chair. "If we put the little girl into her chair now, she probably will rest more easily," he said. "The seat in the other one is too hard for comfort." He did not wait for anyone to help him, but at once lifted weak Clara up in his strong arms and set her very gently down in the soft place he had prepared. Then he spread the rugs across her knees and wrapped up her feet on the cushion as comfortably as if he had done nothing in all his life but look after invalids. Grandmama looked at him as if she could not believe her eyes. "My dear Nuncle," she exclaimed, "if I knew where you learned to care for the sick, I'd have all the nurses sent to the same place for their hospital course. Who taught you how?" Nuncle smiled a little. "It comes more from experience, I suppose, than from study," he answered. But in spite of the smile, there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. From out the long-forgotten days of his past, Nuncle's mind again turned to the suffering face of a man who used to sit wrapped up in a chair, just like Clara, and who was so badly crippled that he could scarcely move a muscle. The dream figure from the past was Nuncle's army captain, whom he had found lying on the ground after a fierce battle in Sicily, and had carried on his back from the field. And from that time on, the captain wanted none but Nuncle as a nurse, and never let him out of his sight, until death at last put an end to his great suffering. The face of his sick friend again appeared to Nuncle, and seemed to say that it was now his duty to nurse poor Clara, and to show her all the comforting care that he understood so well. The sky stretched dark blue and cloudless away over the hut, and the pines and the lofty cliffs that rose high into the air, gray and shimmering. Clara could not tire of gazing at the view. Her heart was so stirred by it. "Oh, Heidi, I wish I could go around with you," she cried out longingly, "around the corner of the hut and under the fir trees, and then I could visit every place that I've heard of so much, but have never seen." Just then Heidi made a great effort, and sure enough she succeeded in wheeling the chair across the dry sward until it was beneath the firs. Here she halted. Clara had never before seen anything like these tall old pine trees. whose long and widespread boughs grew down to the ground and became larger and thicker there, and Grandmama, too, who had followed the children, stood and gazed at the trees in wonder. She hardly knew which to think more lovely, the wrestling summits so full of foliage, or the straight, strong tree trunks like pillars. The mighty branches told their own story of the long row of years that they had been standing up there, while down below in the valley men had come and gone, and everything had changed. But the trees were as they were in the beginning. After a while, Heidi pushed the wheelchair up to the goat stable and opened wide its small door so that Clara could see all of it. There was really not much inside, as the occupants of the stall were not at home. Clara called with much regret, "Oh, Grandmama, if I could only wait for Schweinli and Barely and all the other goats and Peter. I can never see them all if we have to start home as early as you said, and that would be such a shame."
"Dear child," said her grandmamma, "let's just enjoy all the lovely things that are here, and not mind so much about what isn't."
She followed after the chair, which Heidi was pushing. "Oh, see the flowers!" Clara called a moment later. "Whole bushels of delicate red flowers, and then all the little swaying bluebells. I wish I could get out and pick some of them." Heidi ran off at once and brought back a large bunch of them. "Oh, but they're nothing at all, Clara," she said, as she laid the flowers in her friend's lap. "You just ought to go with us up to the pasture, and then you'd see something, I tell you. In one spot altogether, there are ever so many bushes of red centauries, and lots more bluebells than there are here, and besides so many bright yellow wild roses that the whole field looks as though it was pure gold. And then there are some flowers with big leaves and a big name, too, Heliopsis. That's what Grandfather calls them, and he is always right. But Peter says they're only sun's eyes. Oh, and then there are the brown ones, too, you know the ones I mean, with little round tops, which smell so good. My, but it's fine in that place. When once you sit down there, you never, never want to get up again. It's so lovely." As she went on to tell about all this, Heidi's eyes sparkled with longing to see it again, and Clara caught the flame of her friend's excitement, until in her own soft blue eyes one could see reflected every bit of Heidi's enthusiasm. "Oh, Grandmamma, do you suppose I could go up there? Do you think I could be carried so high?" the sick girl asked eagerly. "Oh, Heidi, if I could only go climbing on the mountain with you wherever I wanted to." "I'll push you if you want me to," Heidi said quietly. And to show her how easy it would be for her, she ran around with the chair so fast that it almost got away from her hands and flew down the mountain. But Grandfather was standing close enough to catch the chair at just the right moment. While they had been chatting under the fir trees, Grandfather had not been idle. The table and several chairs were now placed by the bench before the hut, and everything was ready for them to eat their dinner out of doors. Their food was still steaming in the kettle over the fire inside the hut, or toasting on the long fork over the coals. But it was not long before Grandfather had carried everything out to the table, and the whole company had sat happily down to its meal. Grandmamma was quite enthusiastic about this dining room of theirs, from which one could see far down into the valley, and beyond the mountains into the blue distance. A gentle wind found the faces of the table companions, and whispered so charmingly in the fir trees that one might have thought it music especially ordered for the feast.
"I never had such an experience before," cried Grandmamma. "It's just splendid. But what do I see?" she added in a tone of the greatest surprise. "I really do believe, Clara, that you've started on a second piece of cheese."
There was a second piece of shining yellow cheese on Clara's slice of bread, to be sure. "Oh, Grandmamma, that tastes so good. It's better than the whole hotel dinner in Ragaz," Clara cried, taking a big bite of the appetizing food.
"Eat away all you can," Meadow Nuncle said, well pleased. "Our mountain winds are a great help to the appetite, even if the cooking isn't very good."
So the happy meal went on. Grandmama and Meadow Nuncle had liked each other from the very first, and they kept the talk going in a most lively manner. They seemed to have the same thoughts about men and things and the way the world was wagging. You would really have thought they had been close friends for years. A long time had passed when suddenly Grandmama looked toward the west and said, "We must be starting along, Clara. The sun will be setting before we know it. It's time for the people to be coming back with the horse and the basket chair." At these words, a sad look stole into Clara's face, which until that moment had been so merry, and she begged eagerly, "Oh, Granny, just an hour or two more. Why, we haven't even seen the cottage yet, and Heidi's bed and everything. I wish the day was 10 hours longer."
"Well, it isn't," Grandmama said, "so I guess we'll have to get along the best we can."
But she wished to see the hut, and so they all got up from the table, and Nuncle steered the wheelchair with steady hand to the door. But when they got there, the chair would go no further, for it was too broad to pass through the opening. Nuncle paused only a moment when he saw this new difficulty. He raised Clara into his strong arms and carried her into the house. Grandmama walked all around, looking carefully at the way it was furnished, and she seemed to be very merry at the sight of some of the household objects, all of which were so clean and tidy and so well arranged.
"That's your bed up there, Heidi, I suppose," she said.
And before anyone realized what she was doing, she had quickly climbed the ladder that led to the loft. She walked over to the window and peered through it.
"My, how nice it smells up here," she cried. "It must be a very healthful place to sleep."
By this time, Grandfather had climbed up too, with Clara still in his arms, and Heidi followed right on his heels. They stood grouped around Heidi's bed that was so neatly made up, and Grandmama, lost in pleasant thoughts, was gazing straight before her, taking deep breaths of the sweet odors of the hay. Clara couldn't think of anything finer than Heidi's bedroom. "What a jolly room you have, Heidi," she exclaimed. "From your bed you can look straight at the sky, and everything has such a nice smell, and just hear the fir trees rustling out there. It's the sweetest, dearest room in all the world." Nuncle cast a quick look at Grandmama.
"I have a fine idea," he said, "if only your Grandmama will listen to it and not say no. How would it be to keep this little girl up here on the mountain for a while? It might be just the thing for her. Why, we could make an entirely separate bed, soft as down, from all the shawls and rugs that you've brought. And Grandmama need not worry about the care her little girl will get, for I'll look after her myself."
Clara and Heidi burst into a duet of happy shouts. You would have thought them two birds just free from their cage. As for Grandmama, her face lighted up with joy. "My dear Nuncle, you are a splendid fellow," she said. "What do you think I just had in mind? I was saying to myself, if you please, wouldn't life up here be the finest thing in the world for our child? But who would look out for her? And what a nuisance her care would be to the one that nursed her."
"Nonsense! No trouble at all."
"And here you are, suggesting it yourself, quite as if it were an everyday matter. Oh, how grateful to you I am, dear Nuncle. I thank you from the bottom of my heart." In her excitement, the old lady shook Nuncle's hand time and time again, and he seemed more than delighted to see her so glad. Nuncle became very busy at once. He carried Clara back to her chair in front of the hut, and Heidi tagged along after them, feeling that she could not jump high enough to show her joy at the unexpected turn of events. Then Nuncle picked up all the shawls and rugs lined with fur and piled them in his arms. Smiling with satisfaction, he said,
"It is lucky that Lady Grandmama provided enough coverings for a winter campaign. We shall need them all." "My dear nuncle," replied the old lady briskly, "I was taught that an ounce of prevention was worth a pound of cure. A traveller in your mountains is indeed lucky to escape high winds and storms and cloudbursts, and we had such luck and are grateful for it. But still my wraps are going to be of good use to you, are they not?" While the old people were having this talk, they had been on their way back up to the hayloft. A moment later they were spreading the shawls across the bed, one at a time. Finally there were so many of them on the couch that it looked like a small fortress. "Now just let me see a single wisp of hay sticking through," Grandma said defiantly. She pressed down hard with her hands on all sides of the bed, but the soft mass of rugs made such a thick wall that nothing could really stick through it. Entirely satisfied with her work, Grandmama then climbed down the ladder and went out to see her two little wards. They were sitting close together, their faces were shining with joy, and they were planning what they would do from morning to night all the time that Clara stayed on the mountain. But how long would this visit be? That was now the burning question that must be laid before Grandmama at once. She answered by saying that Nuncle would know best about that, and they must ask him. And as he happened to come along at just that moment, the question was put to him. He said he thought they ought to be able to tell in 4 weeks whether the mountain air was doing good to the little patient or not. And then the children really did scream in their delight, for they had not dared even to hope for such a long time together. Soon after this, the porters with their basket chair and the young guide with his horse were seen marching up the trail. The porters were sent right back again, for there was no longer any need of their services. When Grandmama was on the point of mounting her horse, Clara called up to her happily, "Oh, Grandmama, this is no real goodbye, for you'll be coming to visit us every so often to see what we're doing, and that's going to be great fun, isn't it, Heidi?" Heidi's joys that day had been heaped upon her with so generous a hand that she no longer knew how to find words for things. So she said yes by jumping as high as she could in the air. Then Grandmama mounted the trustworthy beast of burden. Nuncle at once seized the horse's bridle rein and started to lead it carefully down the steep path. The old lady tried to persuade him not to bother about her safety. She said there was not the slightest need of his doing so, but Nuncle declared he wouldn't be satisfied unless he kept her company at least as far as Dörfli, because the mountain was so steep that horseback riding was not without its dangers. Grandmama decided, now that she was to be alone, not to take lodgings in the hamlet, for she would surely be too lonesome there. She preferred to go all the way back to Ragaz, and from there she could take her alpine journey again whenever she wished to go. Long before Nuncle had returned, Peter came running along with his goats. When the animals saw Heidi, they all rushed in her direction, and in an instant, Clara in her chair, together with Heidi, was surrounded by the herd. And one goat would keep crowding and shoving to see over the head of his fellow until he was called by name to come forward and be introduced to the invalid. So it happened that almost before she realized it, Clara had struck up the much-longed-for friendship with little Snowhopper, Mary Goldfinch, Grandfather's clean pair of goats, and all the rest, including Big Turk. While this was taking place, however, Peter hung off to one side and cast occasional frowning looks at happy Clara. As the children both called out to him a friendly, "Good night, Peter," he did not answer, but slashed at the air with his rod so angrily that you might think he wanted to cut it in two. Then he started to run down the trail, his followers after him. There was one last thing to come, to be the end of all the lovely things that Clara had seen that day on the mountain. When at last she was lying on the broad, soft bed up in the loft, with Heidi close beside her, she looked through the open round window right into the heart of the twinkling stars, and cried out, quite carried away by their beauty,
"Oh, Heidi, look! It feels as if we were being driven straight to heaven in a high wagon. Doesn't it? And Clara, do you know why the stars are so happy and keep winking at us so?" "No? How should I know that? What do you mean?" demanded Clara. "Why, the stars up there in the sky. See how nicely the dear God arranges everything for people. No one has to worry or to feel unsafe, because he knows everything will turn out for the best. And that makes the stars so happy that they wink to us to be joyful too. But you know, Clara, we mustn't forget to pray and ask the dear God to think of us while he's looking after others so nicely. And then we can always feel so safe too, and never be afraid of anything." At that, the children popped up in bed again and said their prayers for the night. Then Heidi put her head on her little round arm and was asleep in a second. But Clara lay awake a long time, because she had never before known anything half so wonderful as this place to sleep in the starlight. Besides, she had hardly ever seen the stars, for she had never been outside the house at night, and inside the thick shades had been pulled down long before the stars appeared. But now, every time she started to close her eyes, she just had to open them, just for once, to make sure the two big bright stars were still shining through the window, and to see if they were really winking in that funny way that Heidi had spoken of. And they always were. So Clara just could not look enough at their sparkling and gleaming, until at last her eyelids closed of their own weight, and in her dreams she was still seeing them, the twin stars that were so large and brilliant. Chapter 21. Further Happenings on the Mountain. The sun was just rising up behind the cliffs and casting its golden rays across the hut and down over the valley. Meadow Nuncle had been watching with quiet eagerness, as he did every morning, the thin mists lift from the heights and the valleys round about him, and the whole countryside come forth from its twilight shadows and awake to a new day. Clearer and brighter grew the light clouds of early morning, until the sun had quite appeared to bathe cliffs and forests in its golden glory. Then Nuncle walked back to the cottage and climbed the frail ladder. Clara had just opened wide her eyes and was staring in the greatest amazement at the bright sunbeams that streamed in through the round window to dance and gleam on her bed. She had forgotten where she was and did not recognize the scene about her. But then she noticed Heidi sleeping beside her and heard the kindly voice of Grandfather asking, "Sleep well? You're not tired, are you?" Clara said that she was not tired at all. In fact, she had not once moved after she had got to sleep. This pleased the old gentleman, and he set to work at once to care for the invalid, so skillfully that you might have imagined he had no other occupation in life than to attend to the needs of sick children. By this time, Heidi was also awake, and surprised to find that Grandfather had got her little friend dressed and up in his arms, and all ready to carry downstairs. She did not want to be left behind, so she dressed herself as quick as lightning and flew down the ladder and out of doors. But there she halted in great surprise to find what her grandfather had been doing. When the children were safely tucked away in the loft the evening before, he had planned a way of bringing the broad wheelchair inside the house. The door of the hut was too narrow to admit the chair, and so he had to hit upon some other scheme. All at once an idea came to him. He took off 2 wide boards from the back wall of the shop, and so made a large opening. The chair was wheeled in through this, and then the boards were put back in their place, but not nailed fast. Heidi appeared just as Grandfather was settling Clara in her chair. He had taken off the boards, and was going to wheel the child out of the shop into the morning sunshine. When he had done this, he left the chair standing in the middle of the lawn, and went back to the goat shed. Heidi ran to Clara's side. The cool breeze blew about the faces of the children, and a spicy smell from the fir trees drifted down to them on each new breath of wind. Clara filled her lungs with it and leaned back in her chair with a feeling of such health as she had never known before. In all her life, she had never drawn in deep breaths of fresh morning air under the open sky, and at this moment the pure mountain breeze was blowing about her so cool and refreshing that every touch of it brought new enjoyment. And above all else, there was the clear, sweet sunshine, which was so lovely and warm upon her hands and upon the dry lawn at her feet. Clara had not imagined that it could be like this up on the mountain. "Oh, Heidi, I wish I could stay up here with you forever and ever," she cried. She twisted happily in her chair, first one way and then another, so as not to miss a bit of the air and the sunshine. "Now you'll see it's just as I said it was," Heidi answered, smiling. "Grandfather's place on the mountain meadow is the nicest spot in the world." At that moment, Grandfather came from the stable toward the children, carrying in his hands 2 bowlfuls of milk as white as snow. He handed one to Clara, the other one to Heidi. "That is good for a little girl I know," he said, nodding to Clara. "It's Schweinli's milk, and makes people strong. To your good health, drink hearty." Clara had never drunk goat's milk before, so she had to sniff at it first, just a bit, to see what it was like. But when she saw that it tasted so good that Heidi drank her whole bowlful down without pausing for breath, she waited no longer. She started and drank and drank and drank until there was not a single drop left. For honestly, it was so sweet and nourishing, you'd have thought there was sugar and cinnamon in it. "Tomorrow we'll have 2 apiece," Grandfather said. He chuckled with pleasure to see how closely Clara had followed Heidi's lead. Peter now appeared with his troop, and while Heidi was receiving her morning greeting from all the pushing goats, Nuncle took Peter off to one side so he could hear the message he had for him. For the animals were bleating so, each one trying to express his love and joy more loudly than the others, now that Heidi was in their midst, that you could hardly hear yourself think. "Now you just mind what I say," Nuncle warned Peter. "From now on, let Schweinli go wherever she wants. Her instinct teaches her where the best grazing is. So if she wants to climb way up, you follow along. The pasture she finds will be good for the others too. Even if she starts to go much higher than usual, don't hold her back, do you hear? She knows better than you do where to go, and it won't hurt you any to do a little work for once in your life. We want Schweinli to have the best food so her milk is perfect. Why are you looking over yonder as if you wanted to swallow somebody? Nobody's going to hurt you. Come, be off with you, and don't forget what I've said." Peter always did just what Nuncle told him, so he began his march without delay. But you could see that he was thinking about something, for he kept turning his head around and rolling his eyes. The goats followed his lead, and shoved Heidi along a little way with them. This suited Peter all right. "You must come with me," he called to her in the middle of the flock threateningly. "You've got to come if I have to follow Schweinli wherever she goes." "No, I can't," Heidi answered, "and not again for a long time either, for all the time that Clara stays with us. But Grandfather said that perhaps sometime we could go up together." With these words, Heidi twisted her way out of the herd and ran back to Clara. And then Peter shook his fists in such hate toward the sick girl's chair that the goats sprang away from him. But he ran after them quickly, and without stopping, kept on until he was out of sight, for he was afraid that Nuncle might have seen his threatening gestures, and he was just as glad not to know what the old gentleman might say about all that shaking of fists. Clara and Heidi had so many plans for that day that they did not know where to start. Heidi suggested that they first write a letter to Grandmama, for they had agreed to write one every day. The old lady had not been quite sure how Clara would like such a long visit up on the mountain, or whether it would really be good for her. and so she had made the children promise to write as often as they could and tell her everything that was going on. In that way she could tell whenever she might be needed on the mountain, and until that time she could quietly remain where she was. "Do we have to go inside to write?" Clara asked. She was quite ready to send the report to Grandmama, but she did not want to go into the house. It was so lovely out of doors. Heidi knew how that could be managed. She ran quickly into the cottage, and soon came back, loaded down with her school things and the low three-legged chair. Then she set her reading book and her writing tablet on Clara's lap, so she could rest her hand upon them, and she sat down on the stool by the bench, and then they both began their story for Grandmama. But Clara could not write more than a sentence without laying down her pencil and gazing about her. It was too lovely for words. The breeze was not now so cool as it had been. It fanned their faces gently and murmured in the fir trees above them. Merry little insects were humming and darting about in the pure air, and a great stillness brooded over the broad sunlit fields. Tall cliffs of rock looked down big and immovable, and deep peace rested on the valley below them. Only now and then was the stillness broken by the glad cry of some shepherd lad, and by the soft echoes repeated by the crags round about. The morning passed away like a dream, and the first thing the children knew, Grandfather was bringing their steaming bowls out to them, for he said they must stay out in the air with the little girl as long as there was a ray of light left in the sky. So their dinner was got ready in front of the cottage, just as on the previous day, and eaten with enjoyment. After the meal, Heidi wheeled Clara in her chair over under the pines, because they had decided to spend the afternoon in the fine shade there, and tell each other everything that had happened since Heidi had left Frankfurt. Even though there had been nothing during that time at all out of the usual run, still Clara had all kinds of little things to tell about the people who lived in the Sesamon house, and whom Heidi had come to know so well. So the children sat together under the old pine trees, and the more eagerly they talked, the louder became the twittering of the birds on the branches above them, for all the chattering down below interested the birds a great deal, and they wished to take part in it. Again the time fled quickly by, and evening was there before they knew it, and the goat army was rushing down upon them, with their leader close behind, a frown on his brow and anger in his face. "Good night, Peter," Heidi called to him when she saw he had made up his mind not to stop. "Good night, Peter," Clara also shouted pleasantly. But he did not return their greeting, and with a grunt of anger drove the goats on down ahead of him. Now when Clara saw Grandfather lead dainty Schweinli off to the stable to be milked, she was at once seized with such a strong desire to have the spicy milk that she could scarcely wait until it was brought to her. She was as much astonished as anybody at her appetite. "Isn't it funny, Heidi?" she asked. "As far back as I can remember, I have eaten only when I had to, and everything I put in my mouth tasted like cod-liver oil. 1,000 times I have thought to myself, oh, if I never have to eat another bite. And now it's all I can do to wait until Grandfather gets here with the milk." "Yes, I know what that feeling is," Heidi answered sympathetically, for she was remembering the days in Frankfurt, when everything stuck in her throat and wouldn't go down. But Clara could not understand what had happened to her. As long as she had lived, she had not spent a single day in the open air until now, and in air as pure and bracing as that of the mountain. When Grandfather appeared with their bowls, Clara lost no time in seizing hers and thanking him for it. Then she drank the milk down in long, eager swallows, and finished ahead of Heidi. "Could I have a little more?" she asked, holding out her bowl to Grandfather. He nodded with a pleased smile, took Heidi's bowl too, and went back to the hut. When he appeared later, he was bringing, with each bowl, a thick cover, which was, however, made of different material from the ordinary top. In fact, it looked somewhat like bread. That afternoon, Grandfather had taken a stroll over to Green Mayenzace, to the herdsman's cottage where sweet yellow butter was churned. He had brought back from there a fine round pat of it. Then he had taken 2 nice slices of bread and spread the sweet butter on top of them, fine and thick. They were for the children's supper. The 2 girls both took such big bites into the delicious slices that Grandfather stood and watched what was going to happen. He was so pleased. Later on, when Clara was looking up again at the twinkling stars, she could not keep awake, but imitated Heidi. Her eyes closed almost immediately, and a sound, healthful sleep overtook her, such as she had never known before. In the same delightful way the next day passed, and then the next one. And finally there came a great surprise for the children. 2 strong porters came climbing up the mountain, each carrying on his shoulders feather mattresses, already arranged in beds, both covered over exactly alike, with a white spread that was spotless and brand new. The men also had a letter from Grandmama to deliver. The letter said that the beds were for Heidi and Clara, so they could now get rid of the hay couches, and from that time on sleep in a regular bed. In winter, Heidi could take one of them down to Durfley with her, but the other was always to stay up on the mountain, so Clara might find it when she came back there. Then Grandmama praised the children for their nice long letters to her, and begged them to keep writing to her, one every day, so that she could have all the fun they had, just as if she were there with them. Grandfather had gone into the house, thrown Heidi's couch of hay over on the heap of straw, and put away her coverings. Then he returned in order to help the men carry the beds up into the loft. Then he shoved them close together, so that from both pillows the view out the window might be the same, for he knew the joy the children took in the light that shone in there morning and evening. Meanwhile, Grandmama stayed down in the summer resort Ragaz, and was very much pleased with the good news that came to her day by day from the mountain. Clara's delight in her new manner of life kept daily increasing, and she could not speak highly enough of the kindness and loving care given her by Grandfather. She wrote of how funny and merry Heidi was, a lot more so than she had ever been in Frankfurt, and of how each morning, when Clara woke up, her first thought was, "Praise be to God, I am still on the mountain." Such news as this was delightful to Grandmama. She decided, therefore, that as everything was going on so well, she would put off her visit to the mountain a little longer. And she was not sorry to do this, because the ride up the steep trail and down again was rather difficult for her. Grandfather must have taken a quite unusual interest in the recovery of his small ward, for not a day passed that he did not think of something new that might help her to gain strength. Every afternoon he now went climbing farther and farther up the cliffs, and from each walk he brought back a small parcel which sweetened the air for a long distance, like spicy pinks and thyme. And when the goats came home in the evening, they would all begin to bleat and jump and try to crowd through the door of the shed where the bundle lay, for they recognized its smell. But Nuncle had closed the door tightly, for he did not propose to scale the high cliffs where the rare plants grew just so the herd of goats could have a fine meal without effort. No, indeed. The herbs, one and all, were for Schweinli, and were meant to make her milk richer. And it was plain to see how much good this unusual care did little Swan, because she now tossed her head more actively than ever, and her eyes fairly flashed fire. And so it got to be 3 weeks from the day that Clara first reached the mountain. For several days past, whenever Grandfather carried her down in the morning to be placed in her chair, he would be sure to ask, "Isn't this little girl going to try just once to stand on her feet for a moment?" Each time, Clara would try to do as he wanted her to, but would cry out after a moment, "Oh, it hurts too badly." Then she would cling to him for support. But next time, Grandfather would see that she tried just a little longer. There had not been so fine a summer on the mountain for years. Every day the shining sun moved across a cloudless sky, and all the little flowers opened their cups wide so the sun could drink in their beauty and their sweetness. And in the late afternoon, it cast its purple and pink lights across the rocky horns of the mountain peaks and the glacier, and then sank into a flaming sea of gold. Heidi told her friend Clara about this sight again and again, for it could be seen in all its glory, only if you were high up in the pasture, and she was never tired of telling about the place on the slope far above, where there grew large masses of gleaming golden wild roses. And she described the bluebells, of which there were so many that one would think the grass itself had turned blue. And then, nearby, were the great bushes of brown mace flowers that had so sweet a smell one wanted to stay on the ground close to them and never go away. It was while Heidi had been seated beneath the firs, talking with Clara about the flowers up there, and the evening sun and the shining crags, that she was suddenly overcome by such a longing to see the place again. She had to jump to her feet and run to Grandfather, who was in the shop at his carving bench. "Oh, Grandfather," she called out before she had even reached his side, "won't you take us up to the pasture tomorrow? It's just perfectly lovely up there now."
"That suits me all right," the old gentleman said with a nod. "But then the little girl must try to do me a favor in return. She must try this evening to stand on her feet just as long as she can."
Shouting for joy, Heidi ran back with her news to Clara, and the invalid promised to stand on her feet just as often as Grandfather wanted her to, for she was very eager to take this trip up to the beautiful goat pasture. The moment she saw Peter coming down that evening, Heidi was so full of happiness that she called out to him, "Listen, Peter, we're coming up with you tomorrow to spend the whole day." Peter's only answer was a growl, like that of an angry bear. In his rage he struck at Distelfink, who, innocent of any wrongdoing, was trotting at his side. But the agile goldfinch had seen his movement just in time, and jumped out of reach over Schneehoppli's back. So Peter's blow fell on empty air. Clara and Heidi went to bed that night, filled with the greatest expectations. They were so occupied with their plans for the next day that they made up their minds to stay awake all night, so they could keep talking over it until it was time to get up. But hardly had their heads touched their pillows when their chatter ceased, and Clara saw before her in a dream a great big field all sky blue. It was so thickly sown with just bluebells, while Heidi heard the bird of prey scream down from the heights, "Come on! Come on!" This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Heidi. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.